On March 18, 1972, at Madison Square Garden in New York, Frank Sinatra completely lost his voice 30 minutes before his sold-out concert. What he did instead of canceling created the most unforgettable performance in entertainment history, and proved that true artistry transcends physical limitations. The day had started like any other for Frank Sinatra. He'd arrived in New York City on March 17th, checking into his usual suite at the Waldorf Astoria. The spring air carried that distinctive Manhattan energy that had always inspired him, and Frank spent the morning walking through Central Park, mentally rehearsing the setlist that would mark his triumphant return to the city that never sleeps. But by late afternoon, something felt wrong. Frank Sinatra was warming up his voice backstage at Madison Square Garden when he felt the familiar scratch in his throat become something much worse. It was 7:30 p.m. on March 18, 1972, and 20,000 people were settling into their seats for what had been advertised as Frank's triumphant return to New York after a 2-year absence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew Frank's history. This was the same venue where he'd watched countless boxing matches, the same city where he'd started his career at the Paramount Theater in 1942. Madison Square Garden represented everything Frank loved about New York: its raw energy, its demanding audience, its refusal to accept anything less than perfection. But in his dressing room, Frank was experiencing every performer's worst nightmare. His voice, the instrument that had made him the most famous entertainer in the world, had completely abandoned him. Not a whisper, not a croak, not even a breath of sound could escape his throat. The panic that gripped Frank in that moment was unlike anything he'd experienced in 30 years of performing. He'd faced hostile crowds, technical failures, even death threats. But this was different. This was the complete failure of the very thing that defined him as an artist. Dr. William Patterson, Frank's personal physician, had rushed to the venue after Frank's panicked call. His diagnosis was immediate and devastating: acute laryngitis complicated by vocal cord swelling, so severe that attempting to sing could cause permanent damage. The doctor's face was grave as he examined Frank's throat with a small flashlight, shaking his head with the kind of professional concern that left no room for optimism. "Frank," Dr. Patterson said, setting down his medical bag with deliberate care, "in 30 years of treating performers, I've never seen vocal cord inflammation this severe. The tissue is so swollen that even attempting to whisper could cause scarring that would end your career permanently." But the most shocking part was yet to come. "Frank, you need to cancel," Dr. Patterson continued, his voice heavy with the weight of ending someone's dreams. "If you try to perform tonight, you might never sing again. Your vocal cords are inflamed to the point where even speaking is dangerous. One wrong note, one sustained phrase, and the damage could be irreversible." Frank stared at himself in the dressing room mirror, seeing not the confident entertainer who had conquered audiences worldwide, but a vulnerable man facing the potential end of everything he'd worked for. The reflection showed someone who had built his entire identity around his voice, the same voice that had lifted him from the streets of Hoboken to the pinnacle of American entertainment. Outside his dressing room, Frank could hear the murmur of 20,000 people who had paid premium prices, some traveling from as far as California and Florida, expecting to hear Old Blue Eyes deliver the performance of a lifetime. The tickets for this concert had sold out in 4 hours, with scalpers asking 10 times face value on the streets of Manhattan. Many fans had planned their entire vacations around this single evening. The financial implications of canceling were staggering: refunds approaching $400,000, potential lawsuits from disappointed fans, the damage to his reputation that might take years to repair. Frank's manager, Mickey Schulman, was pacing outside the dressing room, fielding calls from venue officials and insurance companies, all demanding to know whether the show would go on. But those considerations paled next to Frank's fear of disappointing the people who believed in him. These weren't just ticket holders. They were fans who had followed his career through its peaks and valleys, who had supported him during his comeback from career-threatening scandals, who saw him as more than just an entertainer. "Doc, what are my options?" Frank asked. though his question came out as barely audible whisper that Dr. Patterson had to lean in to hear. The effort of producing even those few words sent sharp pain through Frank's throat, confirming the doctor's dire assessment. Complete vocal rest for at least 2 weeks, possibly a month. No speaking, no singing, no sound at all. Your career will survive, Frank. But only if you stop right now. I've seen other singers try to push through injuries like this. Some never recovered their full range, others lost their voices entirely. The silence that followed lasted exactly 37 seconds, during which Frank made the decision that would transform this crisis into the most innovative performance of his career. In those moments of complete quiet, Frank's mind raced through every possibility, every alternative, every creative solution that might salvage not just the evening, but his relationship with his audience. Wait. This single moment changes everything you thought you knew about Frank Sinatra's definition of entertainment. Instead of sending his manager out to announce the cancellation, Frank did something that stunned everyone in the room. He reached for a piece of hotel stationery and wrote in his distinctive handwriting, "Get Dean, Sammy, and Tony on the phone. Tell them I need them here in 1 hour." Don't explain why over the phone. Just tell them Frank needs them. Say it's urgent but not an emergency. Frank's assistant, Joey Villa, a young man from Brooklyn, who had worked for Frank for 3 years, stared at the note in confusion. Joey had seen Frank handle countless crises with cool professionalism, but this request seemed to come from nowhere. "Mr. Sinatra, what are you planning? The audience is expecting you, not them." Frank wrote his response with growing conviction. "I'm going to give these people the show they deserve, just not the way they're expecting. Sometimes the best performances come from the worst circumstances. Trust me on this one, Joey." What Frank was contemplating had never been attempted in the history of live entertainment. Without his voice, he would have to find entirely new ways to connect with his audience, to justify their faith in him, to create an experience that would be memorable for reasons no one could anticipate. For the next hour, Frank's dressing room became the command center for the most ambitious last-minute performance coordination in entertainment history. Phone calls went out to 3 of the biggest names in show business, each representing a different aspect of what made the Rat Pack legendary. Dean Martin was at home in Beverly Hills, relaxing after a week of filming his television variety show. The phone call interrupted his dinner with his wife Jane. But when he heard that Frank needed him, Dean didn't hesitate. "Tell Frank I'll be on the next flight. Whatever he needs." Sammy Davis Jr. was in Chicago, finishing his own concert at the Palmer House when Frank's call reached him. Despite being exhausted from his own performance, Sammy's response was immediate. "Frank saved my career once. If he needs me, I'm there." Within minutes, Sammy was heading to the airport, still wearing his stage clothes. Tony Bennett was the closest, staying at the Plaza Hotel, just 20 blocks away. When the call came, Tony was reviewing sheet music for his upcoming album, but he dropped everything. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he promised, already reaching for his coat. The message was simple but urgent. Frank Sinatra needed them, and they had exactly 60 minutes to get to Madison Square Garden. No questions asked, no explanations offered. Just the understanding that when Frank called, you answered. Meanwhile, Frank was working with the venue's technical crew to implement the most unusual performance setup in Madison Square Garden history. A large video screen was hastily installed above the stage, sophisticated lighting equipment was repositioned to create dramatic shadows and highlights, and the sound system was reconfigured to accommodate multiple performers who had no opportunity to rehearse. The audience thought they were experiencing a technical delay, but then Frank's plan began to unfold. At exactly 9:15 p.m., 45 minutes after the scheduled start time, Frank walked onto the Madison Square Garden stage to thunderous applause. But instead of approaching the microphone with his characteristic swagger, he moved with deliberate, almost ceremonial steps and gestured for complete silence. The crowd's cheering gradually died down. As they sensed something unprecedented was about to happen, Frank pointed to the large screen that had been hastily installed above the stage, and words appeared that would explain everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I cannot sing for you, but I can still perform for you. What you're about to witness has never been attempted before. Tonight we explore what happens when music becomes pure emotion." The crowd's confusion turned to anticipation as Frank began to move across the stage with the fluid grace that had made him a legend. He started with "My Way," but instead of singing, he conducted an invisible orchestra while acting out the lyrics with gestures, facial expressions, and body language so precise that the audience began to understand what he was communicating. Frank's movements told the story of a man reflecting on his life's choices, the regrets, the triumphs, the moments of doubt, and the ultimate acceptance of his path. Without words, his performance became more personal and vulnerable than any vocal rendition could have been. But the real magic was just beginning. At 9:22 p.m., Dean Martin walked onto the stage, having flown from Los Angeles on a private jet in record time. The crowd erupted as they realized this wasn't just a substitution, it was an evolution. Dean took the microphone and began singing "Ain't That a Kick in the Head," while Frank danced beside him, conducting and adding theatrical flourishes that transformed the song into a visual symphony. The chemistry between Frank and Dean, built over decades of friendship and professional collaboration, created an entirely new form of entertainment. Frank's silent performance amplified Dean's vocal delivery, while Dean's singing provided the musical foundation for Frank's visual storytelling. Stop. What you're about to hear changes everything you thought you knew about that March evening. What the audience didn't know was that Frank had spent the previous hour not just making phone calls, but choreographing an entirely new kind of performance. Using a combination of sign language he'd learned from a deaf musician friend, classical dance techniques he'd studied during his film career, and theatrical movement he'd absorbed from working with directors like Gene Kelly, Frank had created a comprehensive system of communication that required no voice at all. Each gesture had meaning, each facial expression conveyed specific emotions, and each movement across the stage told part of the story that his songs usually carried through lyrics. Frank had essentially invented a new language of performance, one that relied on the audience's ability to read emotion and movement, rather than simply listen to words and melody. When Sammy Davis Jr. arrived at 9:35 p.m., still breathless from his rush through Chicago's airport and the cross-country flight, Frank's silent performance had evolved into something unprecedented. The three legends began performing together, but with Frank as the silent conductor, dancer, and storyteller who guided every note and movement. Sammy's arrival brought an explosive energy to the stage. His tap dancing provided rhythmic counterpoint to Frank's flowing movements, while his vocal improvisations responded to Frank's silent cues. The result was a conversation between performers that the audience could witness, but not quite understand, a private language of friendship and mutual respect made public. The chemistry between the three performers, directed by Frank's voiceless but commanding presence, created an energy that filled Madison Square Garden with electricity, unlike anything the venue had ever experienced. Frank would point to Dean for a high note, gesture to Sammy for a tap dance sequence, and use his entire body to communicate the emotional peaks and valleys of each song. What made the performance extraordinary wasn't just the novelty of Frank's silence, but the way his inability to sing had liberated all three performers to explore new ways of connecting with their material and their audience. Tony Bennett's arrival at 9:50 p.m. completed what Frank later called the most important ensemble of my career. Four of America's greatest entertainers were now on stage together, with Frank serving as the silent maestro who orchestrated every moment through sheer force of personality and artistic vision. Tony's sophisticated jazz sensibilities added a layer of musical complexity that elevated the entire performance. His vocal arrangements complemented Dean's casual crooning and Sammy's dynamic showmanship, while Frank's silent conducting unified all three styles into something entirely new. But the most incredible transformation was still to come. As the evening progressed, Frank discovered that his voiceless performance was connecting with the audience on a deeper level than many of his vocal concerts ever had. Without the distraction of lyrics, people were watching his face, his gestures, his entire being, in a way they never had before. They were seeing the man behind the voice, the artist behind the instrument, the human being behind the legend. During Strangers in the Night, Frank's silent interpretation of the lyrics, using only facial expressions and hand movements, brought several audience members to tears. His performance had become pure emotion distilled into movement, and the connection between performer and audience was more intimate than anything he had achieved with words. The song's story of unexpected love was told through Frank's eyes as he scanned the audience, his hands as they moved like a conductor guiding invisible musicians, and his body as it swayed to rhythms only he could hear. The audience found themselves leaning forward, straining to catch every nuance of his wordless communication. Wait until you hear what happened during the final song. For the concert's climax, Frank had chosen New York, New York, but with a twist that no one could have anticipated. Instead of having his friends sing the entire song, Frank gestured for the entire audience to join in while he conducted from the stage, his arms raised like a maestro leading the New York Philharmonic. 20,000 people rose to their feet and sang Frank's signature song while he stood center stage, tears streaming down his face, conducting the largest choir in Madison Square Garden history. Without making a sound, Frank had transformed his audience from passive listeners into active participants in the most inclusive performance ever staged. The sight of Frank Sinatra, silently conducting 20,000 people singing his own song back to him, created one of the most emotionally powerful moments in entertainment history. Dean, Sammy, and Tony joined the massive choir, but it was Frank's silent presence that held everything together, his gestures that guided the tempo, his expressions that conveyed the song's emotional journey. When the song ended, the standing ovation lasted 26 minutes, longer than many complete concerts, but more remarkable than the applause was what happened next. Hundreds of audience members approached the stage, not asking for autographs or photographs, but wanting to shake Frank's hand and thank him for showing them that performance was about more than just sound. Many fans later described the experience as spiritual, transformative, life-changing. They had witnessed, not just entertainment, but a masterclass in human resilience, creativity, and the power of artistic adaptation. Stop. The revelation that's coming next will change how you understand the true meaning of artistic courage. What Frank discovered that night was that losing his voice had actually freed him to communicate in ways he never had before. The constraints of lyrics and melody had been removed, leaving only pure artistic expression. He had been forced to strip away everything except the essence of his connection with his audience. The performance became a masterclass in adaptation, resilience, and the true nature of entertainment. Frank had proven that a great performer isn't defined by their instruments, vocal cords, dance moves, or musical ability, but by their capacity to create emotional connection regardless of the limitations they face. This realization would reshape Frank's understanding of his own artistry and influence how he approached every subsequent performance for the rest of his career. But the impact of that March evening extended far beyond one concert. Word of Frank's voiceless performance spread throughout the entertainment industry within hours, inspiring countless artists to reconsider their own definitions of what constituted a complete performance. The concert was recorded and later released as Silent Sinatra, the Madison Square Garden experiment, becoming one of the most studied performances in entertainment history. Music schools began teaching courses on non-vocal performance techniques, and Frank's approach influenced everyone from mime artists to contemporary musicians exploring multimedia presentations. More importantly, Frank's willingness to risk everything, rather than disappoint his audience, became a template for how artists could turn crisis into opportunity, limitation into innovation, and vulnerability into strength. Years later, when Frank was able to sing again, he often said that losing his voice for one night had taught him more about the true nature of performance than 40 years of singing ever had. That night at Madison Square Garden, Frank reflected in a 1975 interview, "I learned that the voice is just one instrument in the orchestra of human expression. When that instrument fails, you don't stop the music. You find new ways to make the melody heard. The performance also transformed Frank's relationship with his three collaborators. Dean Martin later said that watching Frank command a stage without making a sound was the most inspiring thing I've ever witnessed. Sammy Davis Jr. described it as pure artistry distilled to its essence, and Tony Bennett called it the night Frank proved that true entertainment transcends any single talent. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on Frank himself. The experience of performing without his signature voice forced him to discover aspects of his artistry that he had never explored. In subsequent concerts, Frank began incorporating more movement, more visual storytelling, and more audience interaction into his performances. The legendary Silent Sinatra concert became a turning point, not just in Frank's career, but in the evolution of live entertainment itself. It proved that the most powerful performances often come, not from perfection, but from the courage to adapt when perfection is impossible. And that's how Frank Sinatra's worst professional crisis became his greatest artistic triumph, proving that true entertainers aren't defined by what they can do, but by what they're willing to risk when everything they thought they knew about their craft is stripped away. The voice returned after 2 weeks of complete rest, but the lesson lasted forever. Sometimes losing what you think defines you is the only way to discover what actually makes you great.